In the crucible of World War II, Nazi Germany poured vast resources, scientific talent, and industrial ambition into a terrifying vision of technological supremacy. Behind the battlefield headlines and propaganda spectacles, German engineers, physicists, chemists, and weapons designers were tasked with developing machines that seemed to belong more to the future than to the 1940s. Some were real and operational, some remained prototypes, some never escaped the drawing board, and some, amplified by rumor and post-war myth, became part of the legend of Hitler's so-called wonder weapons. Taken together, they reveal not just the scale of Nazi ambition, but also the dangerous belief that technology alone could reverse military collapse, terrify entire nations into submission, and secure a 1,000-year Reich. One of the most chilling ideas that framed this entire effort was the imagined possibility of a Nazi victory so complete that it would extend across the Atlantic. In that nightmare scenario, New York would lie in ruins, the United States would be forced to witness German triumph, and Adolf Hitler would stand as conqueror on American soil. That fantasy never came to pass, but it was not born from pure delusion. German planners genuinely examined ways to strike distant targets, including Britain, the Soviet Union, and eventually even North America. Their long-range bomber studies, rocket programs, and theoretical suborbital concepts show that the regime was thinking far beyond conventional battlefield weapons. The dream of carrying war across oceans, bypassing fleets and front lines, became central to the mythology of Nazi science. At the heart of this technological drive stood a network of scientists whose brilliance has long complicated the moral story of wartime innovation. Among them were Wernher von Braun, the gifted young rocket engineer who would later help lead America to the moon; Werner Heisenberg, one of the most important physicists of the 20th century, and designers such as Alexander Lippisch, whose aerodynamic work influenced some of the most radical aircraft of the era. Their research took place in a dictatorship where state power, military urgency, and ideological coercion were fused together. Some worked enthusiastically, some worked opportunistically, some navigated survival within a system that rewarded obedience and punished dissent. But the result was the same. Advanced science was placed in the service of one of history's most criminal regimes. No site better symbolizes that fusion of genius and brutality than Peenemünde, the secret research center on Germany's Baltic coast. Chosen for its remoteness, Peenemünde became the most important rocket and advanced weapons complex in Nazi Germany. It was both a proving ground and a symbol of state ambition, a place where laboratories, test stands, workshops, housing, and launch facilities were brought together to create weapons unlike anything the world had seen before. It has often been described as a precursor to both Cape Canaveral and Los Alamos, and in a limited technical sense that comparison holds. It was a place where frontier science was rapidly militarized, but Peenemünde was also inseparable from forced labor, coercion, secrecy, and death. As the war intensified, production tied to these programs increasingly relied on concentration camp prisoners and slave laborers, especially after bombing forced elements of the work underground. Any account that admires the engineering without recognizing the human cost becomes dangerously incomplete. Peenemünde was a cradle of modern rocketry, but it was also part of the machinery of atrocity. The first major products of this world were the V-weapons, named and promoted as instruments of vengeance. Joseph Goebbels, the regime's propaganda minister, presented them not just as weapons, but as symbols of inevitable reversal, proof that Germany still possessed secret power capable of punishing its enemies and changing the course of the war. The V-1 flying bomb was the first of these systems to appear in large numbers. Technically, it was an early cruise missile, a pilotless aircraft powered by a pulse jet engine, launched from ramps or dropped from aircraft, and guided by a relatively simple autopilot. It flew at high subsonic speed and carried an explosive warhead toward preset targets, especially London and southeastern England. The sound of its engine became one of the most terrifying signatures of the late war. Civilians learned that the buzzing overhead meant death could arrive at any moment, and that the sudden silence of an engine cutout often meant impact was seconds away. The V-1 was crude by modern standards, but it introduced a new kind of warfare in which a machine, not a pilot, could travel across the sky and deliver terror to a city. The V-1 also revealed both the strengths and weaknesses of Nazi weapons development. It was innovative, relatively cheap compared with crude bombers, and psychologically devastating. Yet it was inaccurate, vulnerable under some conditions, and strategically incapable of changing the outcome of the war. It killed civilians, damaged infrastructure, and forced Britain to devote major resources to defense. But it did not cripple Allied command, industry, or invasion planning. Like many German late-war weapons, it was impressive enough to inspire fear, but not effective enough to reverse strategic reality. The V-2, however, represented a leap into a different age. Developed from the A-4 rocket under the leadership of Werner von Braun and Walter Dornberger, it became the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. Launched vertically, powered by liquid propellants, and traveling faster than the speed of sound, it could not be intercepted by the air defenses of the day. Its victims received no warning beyond impact. The V-2 was not just another bombardment device. It was a technological breakthrough whose descendants would eventually shape military missile programs and space exploration around the world. The first successful full test took place in 1942 at Peenemünde, and by 1944 the weapon was being used against Allied cities. Yet once again, its revolutionary character did not make it a war-winning system. It was expensive, resource-intensive, and operationally inefficient compared with the immense industrial requirements needed to sustain a total war. As a terror weapon, it was formidable. As a decisive strategic instrument, it came too late in too few numbers and under conditions too chaotic to save the Third Reich. Von Braun's role in this story remains one of the most morally fraught in modern science. He was, beyond serious dispute, one of the century's pivotal rocket engineers. His technical gifts were extraordinary, his vision of spaceflight was genuine, and his later work in the United States would prove foundational to American missile and space programs. But during the war, the V-2 program depended heavily on slave labor, especially at the underground Mittelwerk facility, where prisoners from concentration camps endured horrific conditions and died in vast numbers. To describe von Braun simply as a dreamer of space obscures the historical reality that his scientific achievements were deeply entangled with the crimes of the Nazi state. The line from Peenemünde to the moon is real, but it passes through some of the darkest chambers of the Third Reich. Germany's advanced aerospace projects were not limited to rockets. The Luftwaffe and associated design bureaus pursued some of the most radical aircraft concepts of the war. The Messerschmitt Me 262 became the world's first operational jet-powered fighter aircraft, and it demonstrated how quickly air combat could be transformed when speed, thrust, and firepower entered a new era. Faster than any Allied piston engine fighter, armed heavily and technologically advanced, the Me 262 represented a glimpse of post-war aviation emerging before the war itself had ended. Yet it too suffered from the familiar pattern of delayed development, fuel shortages, pilot training problems, political interference, and insufficient numbers. It was revolutionary, but revolution in design could not compensate for collapse in logistics, production, and strategy. Alongside it came the Arado R-234 Blitz, widely recognized as the first operational jet bomber. Sleek, fast, and difficult for Allied fighters to catch, it showed how jet propulsion could transform reconnaissance and strike missions alike. Had such aircraft existed in quantity years earlier, they might have forced the Allies to adjust their doctrine much sooner. But by the time the R-234 entered service, Germany's broader situation was already deteriorating too quickly for technical elegance to become strategic salvation. The aircraft was remarkable. The war machine supporting it was failing. Other German aircraft programs pushed even further into experimental territory. Alexander Lippish's work on delta wing configurations and tailless aircraft helped lay groundwork for radically unconventional forms. The rocket-powered Me-163 Comet, though dangerous and operationally limited, was one of the most dramatic aircraft of the war, capable of astounding climb rates and extraordinary speed for its time. Flying wing concepts, swept forms, rocket assistance, and other unusual arrangements appeared across late-war German design studies. Some were practical responses to military pressure, especially the need to intercept high-altitude bombers more rapidly. Others were manifestations of a design culture willing to gamble on futuristic solutions under desperate conditions. Among the most famous paper projects was the Silbervogel, or Silverbird, a concept developed by Eugen Sanger and Irene Brett. This was not a stealth spacecraft in the modern sense, but rather a theoretical rocket-powered suborbital bomber intended to skip along the upper atmosphere and strike distant targets, potentially including North America. It was one of the boldest aerospace ideas of its era, and while it was never built, it remains historically important because it anticipated later thinking about reusable spaceplanes, boost glide vehicles, and the possibility of transcontinental or even antipodal bombardment. The concept has often been sensationalized, but its real significance lies in how far German wartime theory sometimes reached beyond immediate battlefield needs into the realm of future astronautics. That willingness to explore the extreme edges of possibility also fed a second layer of the Nazi weapon story, the zone where genuine experimentation blended with rumor, exaggeration, and later myth-making. Disc-shaped craft, vertical takeoff machines, strange propulsion systems, and supposed death rays have all entered the popular lore of Hitler's secret arsenal. Some of these ideas did correspond to real proposals. Germany did investigate unusual vertical flight concepts, novel rotorcraft, and unconventional aerodynamics. But many of the more sensational claims, especially those involving Nazi UFOs or miraculous energy weapons, remain unproven, poorly documented, or heavily distorted by post-war speculation. For a historically accurate narrative, it is essential to distinguish between documented operational systems like the V-1, V-2, Me-262, and AR-234, and the more speculative stories that grew around them. Nazi Germany produced genuine technological breakthroughs. It does not need invented legends to appear dangerous. Even so, some little-known real projects show how broad the regime's ambitions had become. German planners did investigate surface-to-air missiles, including systems such as Wasserfall and the smaller Typhoon concept, in an effort to counter the devastating Allied bombing campaign. Had the Reich concentrated more resources on practical air defense earlier in the war, it might have imposed greater costs on Allied air power. But Germany's decision-making process was fractured by bureaucratic rivalry, ideological pressure, and Hitler's appetite for prestige weapons. Resources were dispersed across too many programs, and too many projects were pushed forward for propaganda value rather than strategic coherence. In the end, German innovation was real, but German management was catastrophically poor. This contradiction defined the entire Nazi war economy. Germany generated brilliant engineering work, yet failed to integrate it effectively into a sustainable industrial and military system. The regime prized secrecy so intensely that knowledge remained compartmentalized. Rival offices duplicated effort. Political leaders intervened in technical decisions they did not fully understand. Production was disrupted by bombing, shortages, and irrational prioritization. Many projects depended on scarce materials, specialized labor, and fragile supply lines that no longer matched the strategic reality of late-war Europe. Even where Germany achieved technical superiority, it often could not exploit that advantage at scale. A few hundred advanced aircraft could not outweigh thousands of Allied planes. A revolutionary missile could not compensate for crumbling fronts, shrinking fuel reserves, and overwhelming enemy industry. The wonder weapons were symptoms of desperation as much as they were instruments of war. The atomic question sits at the center of this tension between fear and reality. Few possibilities were more alarming to the Allies than the idea that Nazi Germany might be first to unlock the bomb. Germany possessed outstanding physicists, including Werner Heisenberg, and it investigated nuclear fission through what became known as the Uranium Club. It also sought heavy water from occupied Norway, where sabotage by Norwegian resistance fighters and Allied efforts targeted production and transport linked to the German nuclear project. These events later assumed near-legendary importance, partly because the stakes were so immense. If Hitler had obtained a nuclear weapon, the consequences for Europe and perhaps the world would have been incalculable. Yet the historical record indicates that Germany never came close to building an atomic bomb on the scale and timetable achieved by the Manhattan Project. The German nuclear effort suffered from fragmented priorities, insufficient industrial commitment, material limitations, and misunderstandings or underestimations regarding what a bomb program would truly require. When Allied investigators of the Alsos mission examined German facilities and materials near the end of the war, They found evidence of reactor research and uranium work, but not a functioning bomb program nearing success. The internment and secretly recorded conversations of leading German scientists at Farm Hall after the war further demonstrated both their surprise at Hiroshima and the limits of what they had achieved. The fear had been justified. The reality was less advanced than many had imagined. Still, it would be a mistake to dismiss Nazi science as mostly fantasy. The Third Reich did produce a series of genuine firsts that permanently changed warfare and technology. The first operational cruise missile, the first operational ballistic missile, the first operational jet fighter, and the first operational jet bomber among them. These achievements mattered. They influenced post-war missile programs in the United States and the Soviet Union, shaped the development of modern air power, and accelerated the beginning of the space age. What failed was not the existence of innovation, but the regime's ability to translate innovation into coherent victory. As the war turned decisively against Germany, the contrast became ever sharper. Allied bombers devastated factories, transport links, and fuel production. The Eastern Front consumed men and material on a colossal scale. The Western Allies pushed closer from France and the Low Countries. Under those conditions, Berlin increasingly looked to miracle solutions. Hitler and his inner circle spoke and acted as though one more breakthrough, one more secret weapon, one more technological surprise might redeem everything. But the deeper the crisis became, the more these projects were forced into unrealistic schedules, dispersed facilities, and desperate improvisation. A scientific culture can do remarkable things under pressure, but no culture of research can thrive indefinitely inside a collapsing dictatorship that murders its labor force, starves its industry, and loses control of the skies. When the Third Reich finally fell in 1945, the world began the process of uncovering what Germany had truly built, what it had only planned, and what it had merely imagined. Investigators seized documents, prototypes, test data, and personnel. The Soviet Union and the United States raced to capture not just hardware, but minds. This scramble revealed another unsettling truth. The victors understood immediately that German science, however compromised morally, contained immense military value. The V-2 alone had already shown what long-range rocketry could mean in the modern age. German aerodynamic research, propulsion work, and guided weapons development promised to shape the next generation of warfare. No figure embodies that transfer more completely than Wernher von Braun. Rather than face Soviet capture or vanish with the regime, he and many members of his team surrendered to American forces. Through Operation Paperclip, the United States brought German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America, where they contributed to missile development and eventually to the U.S. space program. Von Braun worked first on military rockets and later became a key architect of the Saturn V launch vehicle that carried Apollo astronauts to the moon. This transformation from engineer of the V-2 to public face of American spaceflight is one of the most striking and unsettling continuities in 20th century history. The same technical tradition that had been weaponized for Nazi vengeance became central to one of humanity's greatest peaceful achievements. That continuity does not absolve the past, it complicates it. The legacy of Nazi weapons research is not a clean story of scientific progress. It is a story about how modernity can be bent toward terror, how brilliant minds can serve monstrous systems, and how post-war states often chose technical advantage over moral simplicity. The rockets, jet aircraft, and advanced studies that emerged from Germany in the 1930s and 1940s did not vanish with Hitler's bunker. They flowed into the Cold War, into missile arsenals, into aerospace laboratories, and into the dreams and dangers of the nuclear age. What then should be made of the wonder weapons themselves? On one level, they were astonishing achievements of design and engineering. On another, they were strategic failures. They appeared too late, in too few numbers, under the control of a regime too disordered and self-destructive to use them effectively. Their existence frightened the Allies, but fear alone could not win a war already being lost on every front. Germany's leaders believed quality might overcome quantity, shock might overcome attrition, and terror might overcome industrial inferiority. They were wrong. Technological brilliance cannot compensate forever for strategic delusion, moral corruption, and material collapse. And yet the question lingers because the achievements were real enough to make the counterfactuals haunting. What if Germany had prioritized air defense